Today's video has been sponsored by Atlas. Final Fantasy was once known by what Square Enix calls command battles. This is the official way that they group 1 through 10, which encompasses both pure turn-based battles with ATB. This menu-driven combat would be the foundation of the series. Until it wasn't. Final Fantasy 15 would be the first game in the series to entirely step away from command battles, introducing real-time action. Final Fantasy 16 would double down on this even further, by turning the latest entry in the series into an outright hack and slash. 2 years ago now, I made a video about why Square Enix was moving away from turn-based, but since then a lot has happened, including Final Fantasy 16 and Rebirth failing to meet expectations on sales. So today, I want to raise the question, was I wrong about turn-based in Final Fantasy? And should we begin the great return to turn-based? And can a major AAA turn-based game sell well in 2024? But first, a word from our sponsor Atlas. The creators of Persona 3, 4, and 5 bring you a brand new game, Metaphor ReFantazio, taking place in the United Kingdom of Uchronia, where the assassination of the king throws the land into chaos. You and your fairy companion Gallica embark on a journey to lift the curse from the kingdom's lost prince. After playing the game's incredible free demo, which gives you the entire opening prologue for free, I was immediately captivated by this game. A jaw-dropping art style, several gorgeous, fully animated cutscenes, and of course the thing that Atlas always does best, music that will be stuck in your head for days. The combat system masterfully blends action elements with traditional turn-based mechanics. You can engage enemies simply by attacking with a real-time combat action system. This allows you to dispatch of weaker enemies right away, or enemies that are of your level or stronger, it allows you to preemptive strike them, which you can then engage in deep strategic turn-based battles. Look, I know you guys are always looking for great turn-based games, and let me tell you, this is definitely one. In part because it features a highly customizable job system through the use of beings known as archetypes. This allows your characters to fulfill different roles in combat, such as a knight absorbing damage, or a monk that lets you smash enemies with the power of your fists. From forming bonds with new allies, to unlocking new archetypes, exploring sprawling towns, and a number of well-designed dungeons, this is easily Atlas's most ambitious game yet. So be sure to check out Metaphor ReFantazio, with a link in the description and pinned comment below. Whenever we talk about turn-based games selling really well, comparisons to Pokemon are always inevitable, and I've never really found that to be applicable. First of all, people don't buy Pokemon games because they are specifically turn-based. They buy them because they sell you the fantasy of being a Pokemon trainer, and arguably people are so interested in that alone, and they continue to buy the games even when they're less than satisfactory. However, there was one game that really did change everything last year, and that was Baldur's Gate 3. Game of the Year, and one of the highest selling games of last year as well. A game that received astronomical praise and is seen as one of the best RPGs of all time. Of course, this is incredibly ironic. Baldur's Gate 3 launched the same year as Final Fantasy 16. FF16 was predicated on the idea that a turn-based game could not be a major seller in 2024. Yoshi P saying, quote, "I believe I know the fun of command system RPGs, and I want to continue developing them, but I thought about the expected sales of Final Fantasy 16 and the impact that we have to deliver." This is something that I bring up in discussions a lot, that many people look at these action battle systems and see them as this new creative frontier. But the reality is, the primary motivation for moving away from turn-based is a decision more rooted in capitalism than it is artistic freedom. They need these games to sell big because they are tremendously expensive. Look at any icon fight in Final Fantasy 16. It does not take a technical eye to realize how much time and budget went into these moments. They are incredibly expensive. But of course, just like with Pokemon, in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, while it is a high-selling turn-based game, if we are to be frank, it's not the fact that the game is turn-based that made it high-selling. In fact, most people did not look at the turn-based combat and decide, oh yeah, that's why I'm buying this game. In fact, if we're really looking at the trend line here, what really converted people was when they saw what you could do with the bear. Which really is to say, role-playing. And yes, that is an aspect of role-playing, guys. That is what the turn-based games that do sell well typically sell on. Again, with Pokemon, it's that fantasy of being a Pokemon trainer. With Baldur's Gate 3, it is the infinite number of role-playing options you can have in that game. And what I find about turn-based is that turn-based allows the full expression of that role-playing. Choosing commands, really diving into your character's stats and builds. Turn-based really has a way to accentuate the role-playing element. Of course, turn-based isn't a requirement of doing it, but it certainly does help. It is, however, probably true on average that action games are going to sell more. And while there are some people opposed to playing turn-based games, most people generally will play an action game. However, there was one other turn-based game throughout history that managed to be a massive exception to this rule, and still managed to sell millions of units despite it being turn-based. A franchise that continued to see growth despite all of this, and even popularized and gave acceptance to turn-based combat in the West. Of course, that series, ironically, is Final Fantasy. The top-selling Final Fantasy games are still turn-based games. And it's not like the pressure to become an action game is necessarily new. In fact, the pressure to become an action game has been there since almost the beginning. Even during the development of Final Fantasy IV, Hiroyuki Ito came up with the active time battle system as a way of making the games feel a bit more action-oriented, using the time gauge in order to create a sense of urgency within battles. So when it comes to action appealing to a wider audience, this isn't even a new idea within Square Enix. This is an idea that they've had for a very long time. Yet if we go by the numbers, the turn-based Final Fantasies still sold incredibly well, and Final Fantasies 7 and 10 still hold the number 1 and number 2 spot. To be clear though, I'm not saying that Final Fantasy must return to turn-based. Instead, this is a video analyzing the viability of returning to turn-based, and why it might be more viable than ever to do now. These types of games can be seen as niche. However, through staying with them consistently, continuing to perfect their formula, you can oftentimes defy the odds with a game that is normally seen as niche. Persona on paper is one of the most niche games ever, but it hasn't stopped Persona 5 from selling over 7 million units. Nier was also seen as niche, and Nier Automata has sold 8 million units. That's more than the first release of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and more than many other FF games. Before Baldur's Gate 3, no one was thinking that CRPGs are the most popular genre to make. But now that Baldur's Gate 3 is a success, they might actually think that. Game development currently takes so long that if you try to just do something because it's trending, that by the time you release the game, the trend will already be over. Concord was originally pitched all the way back in 2016, when Overwatch won Game of the Year. At that time, it probably seemed really sensible to make a hero shooter. But by the time that game launched, everyone was already tired of hero shooters. This is to say, if FF is just trying to make whatever is popular on the trend line, with 7 or 8 years of development, by the time the game releases, the trend line will already be radically different. Which means that the smartest thing you can do, albeit one of the hardest things to convince your investors of, is to do the thing that everyone else isn't doing. And despite what people will say, turn-based RPGs have only gotten more popular. A perfect example of this would be Lost Odyssey. This game is sitting in the 70s on Metacritic, and most of the big criticism around this game at the time was, unbelievably enough, was simply that it was another turn-based JRPG. That at the time was seen as criticism. But now people talk about turn-based games entirely different, with a sense of fondness and excitement. The love for turn-based games has never been higher. At the time, many people just tolerated Final Fantasy's turn-based. But considering now that that tolerance has shifted to admiration and love, I would actually wager that a turn-based Final Fantasy could be better received for its turn-based mechanics now than it was during the heyday of Final Fantasy turn-based. The rumored Final Fantasy IX remake might be a good test for this. as according to the rumors, FF9 Remake is supposed to be a turn-based game. If the reception goes well, as well as the sales and profitability of the game, we might know which way we should go heading forward. There's also another aspect of this, and it's the fact that turn-based games can be a lot cheaper to develop than action games are. Action games require very complex animation, which of course means that a lot more motion capture work has to be done. Much more complex artificial intelligence in order to power these enemies, and the list just goes on and on. However, if it were to be put simply, action RPGs are a lot more resource demanding than turn-based ones. And when you consider the amount of money that has been spent on Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and the fact that these titles didn't quite meet sales expectations, it's not unreasonable then to say that turn-based would actually help them keep costs under control. Listen, that's not to say that turn-based Final Fantasies were necessarily cheap either. The budgets for games like Final Fantasy VII and X were pretty staggering at that time, but one could also argue that a lot of the budget went to the impressive cinematics, having larger towns, more minigames, and other impressive features. Things that ultimately helped the game stand out even more than if the combat was just action. And another thing too is that, to be honest, there are just a lot of third-person action games, and they're all really good. There's just so much competition in this space that it's really hard to stand out. Take a game like Clair Obscur Expedition 33. It would have been really easy for that game to be another Souls-like, or a Souls-like hack-and-slash hybrid. There are a lot of those types of games out right now. However, there is not a lot of games like Expedition 33 out there. As a result, people are clamoring for this game. It's even managed to hit 250,000 people wishlisting it on Steam. There's not a doubt in my mind that this game would not be having the same response if it wasn't a turn-based game. It's a void that was arguably left by Final Fantasy in the first place, as while there isn't a shortage of turn-based games coming out nowadays, there are very few that have this sort of realistic, with absolutely cutting-edge visuals. The last time this was seen was Lost Odyssey. There is, of course, one other important thing to discuss when we talk about the appeal of turn-based, and that is the appeal to the youth. I'm not entirely sure that it's true that Gen Z straight up doesn't like turn-based. The Persona series has been a massive hit with Gen Z, but it's not just Persona. Honkai Star Rail is an absolute phenomenon, generating $1.3 billion of revenue in its first year, and having over 100 million downloads. This is a turn-based RPG that is hugely popular with younger audiences. All of which is to say is that I don't fully agree with my previous assessment on why action combat is necessary. However, let me also clarify where I stand. I still firmly believe that the correct course of action for Square Enix is to continue to pursue hybrid combat, in part because I think that Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy's combat still really stands out on the modern gaming landscape. Yes, there's a lot of third-person action games out there, and as far as AAA is concerned, maybe more than any other genre. However, what tends to make the most popular third-person action games stick is exceptionally unique combat that you can't really find anywhere else. This is something that I think makes titles like Monster Hunter or the Soulsborne titles really stand out amongst the pack. There's a unique feel to these games that people are looking for and will continue to return to. As a result, if you can produce that type of combat that people feel like they can't get anywhere else, you'll have a monopoly on your own subgenre. And that's exactly what I think Re-Trilogy is. It is its own unique subgenre of action RPG gameplay, something I think they should continue to build on. However, I don't think it's entirely unviable for them to return to turn-based. And while, again, my preference is for them to continue with the Re-Trilogy style of combat, all of this is to say that as things have evolved and the evidence has made itself clear, I don't think the return to turn-based isn't a viable option. It's something I disagree with some of Square Enix's top directors on, as recent developments have made things a bit more clear to me. However, whether they continue to go with the Re-Trilogy style of action RPG combat, or they default back to turn-based, or even go with, God forbid, yet another different battle system for Final Fantasy XVII. The biggest thing I believe is that they need to continue building on what they have there so they can continue to hone their craft and eventually make exceptional experiences built on previous ones, just like they did with Final Fantasy 1 through 10. So yes, Final Fantasy could return to turn-based. I don't know if it should, but I wouldn't say that it's not viable. However, if you are looking for an incredible turn-based RPG, be sure to check out Metaphor ReFantasio and its free demo that gives you the opening prologue of the game, link in the description below.